Chapter 33. Barber College Days 3 Tuesday, November 1, 1960, was my first day in Barber College. I obtained the instruments that I would use in my new profession, and received orientation on the rules and procedures of the school. There were 3 levels of training. The first level was the free department. The second was the junior department, and the third and final level was the senior department. In order to get male subjects that we could practice on, the school offered free barber services to the public. About the only ones that would allow the new students to work on them were the indigent. They were so impoverished that they were required to use the back entrance in the alley. The saying went, if you could make it through the free department, you would probably go all of the way. Let me tell you here and now, it wasn't easy. I had never seen such a collection of human debris. Some of them lived in caves along the nearby Missouri River, and only came a couple of times a year for a haircut and shave. The stench was sometimes overpowering. The department was located on the upper floor of the building, and featured about 20 old antiquated workstations, but it was adequate for the type of clientele that this department catered to. The junior and senior departments were on the street level, in one long room. As you entered the front door off Main Street, the senior department students worked at the first 10 chairs, and the junior department students the following 16 chairs. Unlike the free department, the workstations on the main floor of the school had modern up-to-date equipment. There was a cash register located at the entrance, and the students took turns operating it. We received nothing for any of the services that we performed. The school was the recipient of the monies received. I don't recall what the charge for our services were, but any of the following could be purchased for less than $1. Haircut, shave, shampoo, medicated shampoo, rest facial massage, mud pack, tonic, and dandruff treatment. There were 11 students in our class. Ronald E. Jack Spratt, Burlington Junction Mo, Gail Ramsey, Warrensburg Mo, Robert Karnick, Paris Mo, Gary Harris, St. Joe Mo, Ken Wissig, Deepwater Mo, Jerry Starmer, Maryville Mo, Bill Verbeek, St. Joe Mo, Bill Groom, Kansas City, Missouri, Gene Holt, Kansas City, Missouri, and Jerry Lawson. A man named Farrell owned the school, and I believe that it was a family business, handed down from his father. Bill Chambers told me that prior to World War II, Farrell had been a P-40 pilot, with General Clara Chennault's Flying Tigers in China. The barber instructors were Jim Bach, Dale Ferens, and Bill Schroeder. The medical instructor was Doc Shackelford, and he held both a chiropractic license and barber license. He taught the medical part of our training. I know that you are wondering why in the world would barbers be studying anything medical. Well, I think I may have figured it out. The following is a brief history of the barber profession. Barba is a Roman word, meaning beard, from which the word barber derived. The profession of barbering is one of the oldest in the world, second perhaps to the oldest, and I think we all know what that is. Written records and relics reveal that the priesthood and nobility had been patrons for barbers' services 6,000 years ago. During the time of Moses, in 1450 to 1400 BC, barbers' services became available to the general public. References to barbering can be found in the scriptures, in Deuteronomy 14:1, Leviticus 19:27, and 21:5. In fact, most of the 13th chapter of Leviticus tells how to diagnose and treat diseases, and the 29th to the 37th verses describes how to diagnose and treat face and scalp diseases by shaving and quarantine. Many centuries ago, barbers were the forerunners of physicians and dentists. You could get a haircut, a tooth pulled, and a little blood drained, all in one setting. Bloodletting once was a cure for almost every malady known to man. They used a bandage, rag, after each bloodletting procedure. Then they would hang it out in front of the shop to dry, so that it could be used on their next victim. This became the original emblem of the barber-surgeon profession. This was later replaced by a wooden pole, with red and white strips, the universal symbol of the barber shop. In the early years of the 12th century, a guild of surgeons was organized from elements within the ranks of the barber surgeons. This group applied themselves in the research and study of drugs and medicines, and endeavored to find new methods of healing. As time marched on, medicine advanced through research and science, and the practice of bloodletting dwindled in importance and repute, and in 1745, the Barber and Surgeons' Alliance was completely dissolved. However, the barbers continued the practice of bloodletting and pulling teeth. They also dispensed herbs and medicines out in the rural communities, because physicians were sometimes unavailable. 1775 marked the end of the long and glorious period in the history of the barber profession. It began to decline technically, economically, and morally. By the end of the 19th century, barber shops had become dirty, unsanitary, and undignified. They were characterized as a place to gossip and read naughty magazines. The profession lost most of its respect, and barbers were looked upon as being on the bottom rung of the social ladder. There were a few at the end of the century, who were men of high ideals, who began efforts to lift the profession back to the status it had once known. They formed an organization of journeyman barber groups. In 1893, Mr. A. B. Muller established the first barber school in the world, in Chicago. In 1897, the first barber license law in America was passed in Minnesota. The state legislature wrote and prescribed sanitary practices for barbers, and stipulated the educational and technical standards for barbers. In 1925, the Associated Master Barbers and Beauticians of America established the National Educational Council, whose purposes were to standardize school training and to uplift the barber profession. Some of the subjects of the current curriculum are hygiene, sanitation and bacteriology, the anatomy and physiology of cells. All of the systems of the body, digestive, circulatory, skeletal, muscles, nervous, the skin and all its appendages. The shedding and regrowth of hair, electricity, electrical appliances, light therapy. The use of cosmetics, and their properties. Dermatology, the medical study of skin physiology, and pathology. Distinguishing between conditions that may be corrected cosmetically and those which should be referred to a physician. Lesions, and primary lesions, such as macule, papule, pustule vesicle, bulla, tubercle, wheal, tumors. And then comes the secondary lesions, such as scales, crust, excoriations, fissures, ulcers, scars, pigmentation. Recognizing a disease, such as dermatitis, pityriasis capitis, and dandruff. Infectious, diseased, such as impetigo, erysipelas, tinea capitis, tinea trichophyton capitis, tinea tensurans etc. And we can't leave out those pesky little varmints, pediculosis capitis, and pediculosis pubes. I think you're probably beginning to get the picture. There is much more to becoming a barber than just learning the physical mechanics of the profession. Back when I attended school, they told us that the science part of our training was equivalent to 1 year of nurse's training. I have often suspected that much of the theory that is taught is designed to maintain certain professional standards by eliminating the illiterate and undesirable elements of society. My first week in free department was a memorable experience. Learning to hone and strop a razor, and to slit it across the living flesh of another human being, without reverting back to the ancient custom of bloodletting, is an art that requires a great deal of skill and practice. A surgeon can bury his mistakes, but a barber must live with his. In this free department, it suddenly became clear why we were issued the vial of styptic powder. It was about the only way that you could coagulate the flow of blood that came pouring out of the wounds of our hapless victims. It became an indispensable item during our tour of duty in the free department. During that first week, I happened to look over at the 18-year-old kid Ronald Jack Spratt, who was shaving a wino in the chair next to mine. He was standing with both arms dangling to his sides, and looking over at me with a sheepish grin. In his hand he was clutching a bloody straight razor, and front of his white barber's smock was splattered with blood. He looked a lot like a meat cutter, standing at his butcher's block. He had used up nearly all of his stop leak, but had failed to stem the flow of blood seeping from his patron. Not knowing what else to do, he grinned, shrugged his shoulders and continued to hack away. The wino, who no doubt had visited this establishment before, had anesthetized himself prior to making the trip, and what he was bleeding was probably about 50% cheap wine. One day I had one in my chair giving him a shave, when he soiled himself. That was the day I nearly sold my tools and headed for home, but thank goodness I persevered. When I started to school I thought that I would drive back and forth, but I soon found that it would be about as cheap to stay in the city. I rented a small apartment, a few blocks from the school, but after a couple of weeks, I talked to some of the other students, who were staying at a hotel that was somewhat cheaper, and was also closer to the school, so I moved. It was certainly not the Muehlebach, but it served the purpose. It was called the Puritan, and what a misnomer that was. It was a seedy establishment that had seen its glory days, many years before. It featured a bar in the basement, called the Blue Goose. Joe Corolla was the proprietor of the hotel and bar. The presidential campaign was in full swing, and a new phenomena in political campaigns came on the scene, called television debates. The first one was held on September 26, 1960, and would set the standard for future campaigns. On Tuesday evening, November 8, I had returned to Kansas City, where I would start my second week in school the following day. The big election night had arrived, and Milt Chambers invited me over to his house to watch the returns on TV. Milt was a Democrat, and he and I differed sharply on the candidates. The Masonic Lodge implored its members not to support John Kennedy, because he was a Catholic. Milt got so put out with the lodge that he quit, and gave me his Masonic ring. Seeing as how I did not belong to the Masonic order and had no plans to do so, I eventually gave the ring to my brother-in-law, Jerry Arnold, who was a member. This was the third presidential race that I had voted in, and was the first that my candidate lost, but would not be the last. I would lose only 2 more during the next 30 years. I lost that night, but many years later I was to learn that John Kennedy's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, a former bootlegger, met with the Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana to seek his help in the race. At that time it was the closest in the history. Kennedy won by 120,000 votes. Illinois was the swing vote that won it, and it was pretty common knowledge that Nixon was defeated by the Chicago Cemetery precinct. This is a joke that was going around. A couple of Democrats were out gathering votes in the Cook County Cemetery, and it was growing late and there was one more grave, isolated way down in the corner of the cemetery. One said to the other, "Let's not walk all the way down there for just one vote." The other fellow solemnly replied, "I think we should, he's entitled to his vote the same as the rest of them." Christmas Eve of 1960, I was headed home up the new Interstate 29, for our annual Jarrett Christmas party, that we were hosting. I was running late as usual, and was blazing up the new speedway. This was the first week that it opened, and I was letting my 1956 Buick Roadmaster out, so to speak, when I spied the highway patrol parked on the shoulder. It was too late. His radar gun clocked me at 100 plus. Up ahead the trooper motioned me over, and I pulled onto the shoulder behind a line of cars stretching ahead about 1/4 of a mile. Apparently I wasn't the only one trying out the new highway that night. A couple of weeks later I went to appear before Judge Wilson at the Platte County Courthouse. I had no idea how much I would be fined, so not taking any chances on getting locked up, I took $200 with me. He had a courtroom full of speeders, all of those that were lined up that night along the shoulder were there. He called my name, and said, "Well, I see that you are the fastest one here today." And I thought, oh. He is going to throw the book at me. To my amazement he said that will be $10, plus $7, court cost. Pay the clerk, and I would advise you to slow down when you come through Platte County, because I won't be as understanding the next time you come before me. I could have kissed that old man. But I didn't. I had not only helped build the interstate, I also helped in a small way to pay for it. One day when I was in the final weeks of school, Milt Chambers called me and asked if I could get away that afternoon. His boss had taken a couple of days off, and Milt was needing some help. I was reluctant to try it. Barbering in the school was one thing, but working in a classy barbershop, on full-paying clients, was another. If the inspector for the State Board of Barber Examiners would have happened by, I would be hard-pressed to explain the whereabouts of my license. I was confident that my work was as good as anyone's, and my life had been lived taking chances, so why change now? I had become friends with a fellow who was in the administrative part of the school, and I told him that I had some business to take care of, so he gave me permission to take the afternoon off. Well, I did have business to take care of. Barber business. I don't recall where the shop was located, but it was not far south of the downtown area. It was a nice 2-chair shop, and when I arrived Milt was busy with a client. Shortly after my arrival all her man entered, and Milt told him that I was filling in for his boss, and assured him that I did good work. He climbed into my chair, and became my first paying client. Little did he know, that a student was working on him. This was the first money that I had ever made for myself as a barber, and I was ready to get out of school and start making money for Mr. Jarrett instead of for Mr. Farrell. During my final month of training, a barber named Ronald L. Bud Redman came to the school looking for someone to work for him. He had a shop in Maysville, Missouri, and he asked the school officials if they had any students from his area who would be graduating soon. They informed him that they had a fellow from Cosby, that was 30 years old, and a GI trainee, who was a good barber. I was introduced to Bud and he said that he would give me %80 commission of what I take in. He explained to me that that was pretty much the standard practice. I accepted his offer and was hired. Saturday, April 29, 1961, was my last day of school. We had taken our written final exams, and I passed with flying colors. My average test scores throughout school was 89%, a phenomenal feat for me. I would now be required to serve an 18-month internship, under a licensed barber. It was never my intention to work for someone else, after becoming licensed. For me, the primary attraction of the barber profession was the ability to become self-employed. However, I had another year and a half before I could strike out on my own. It was a good feeling to know that I had a profession that would sustain my family throughout my life. Bud's shop was on the south side of the town square at the west end of the block, diagonally across from the bank. I knew several of the people in the town from my school days at Clarksdale, and from GI Ag School. As luck would have it, one of my schoolmates, Ron Goff from Clarksdale, had a television shop, located in the back room of the barber shop, and his clients entered through the barber shop. Ron had married Maxine DeShawn, his high school sweetheart. He had previously owned a shop in Maryville, Missouri, but had lost it when a large portion of the south side of the square burned. They eventually moved to Maysville, where they purchased a home, and reopened a television shop there. It was while I was there, that Ron and I started playing golf. But he and I were new at the game, and would learn together. There was a 9-hole, sand green, course at the south edge of town. I developed a fondness for the game that would give me many years of both enjoyment and frustration. Ron had a 1954 Studebaker Commander that he wanted to sell. It had an overdrive, and got pretty good gasoline mileage, and I was still driving the Buick Roadmaster. It was a real good car, but it had a bad drinking problem. It was a gas alcoholic. So I bought the Studebaker, and sold the Buick to someone who could afford its drinking habit. There was another shop in town that had 2 barbers that had worked side by side for years. At some point in time during their association, they had a falling out. It was said that they hadn't spoke to one another for 20 years. I find this hard to imagine. I had never heard of such foolishness. I don't think they ever did make up. We decided to take another short trip to southern Missouri. We left Sunday morning, August 13th. Our first stop was at Mom and Dad Hines, where we dropped our little terrier, mongrel, dog, Candy off. We went to Jefferson City, and toured the capital, and then headed on over to the Lake of the Ozarks. We rented a cabin at Speedboat Harbor, and while we were there we met another young couple, Eugene and Helen Cox, from Farmer City, Illinois. They had 4 children, Paula, Dale, Kim, and Lori. They also had a speedboat and a surfboard that they pulled the kids on. Jimmy and Gary had a lot of fun, and so did Mom and Pop. The cabin rented for $7 a day, and our groceries cost us $4.93. It was a short vacation and we would have liked to stayed longer, but I had to get back to work. We were only gone 3 days, but we had a good time, all except Candy. She was real happy to see us back home again. We were charging $1,00 for a haircut, and Bud thought that we should raise to $1,25, but was a bit reluctant about it. We didn't know how it would affect our business. After much deliberation we decided to do it. I don't think we lost a client, and I don't recall if the 2 old competitors ever raised their prices. I always wondered how they ever operated, not being able to converse with one another on such matters. Things were going well, and Bud decided to take a few days of vacation. On the Saturday during their vacation, I recorded my biggest day ever. I cut 64 heads of hair, the most ever during my lifetime. My share of the $80 was an unprecedented $64. Prior to that day, that was the most money that I had ever earned in one day in my entire life. While at Wyeth, the maximum that I reached per day was $10.96. On the construction job, I made about $18 per day. I was once again grazing in tall grass. But not for long. Soon after Bud's return from vacation, he came to work one morning and informed me that his wife thought that too many of his clients were wanting me to do their barber work, and she didn't think that there was enough business for two barbers to share. Bud was a nice fellow and he felt bad about it, but evidently she was afraid I was pulling too much business away from him. There was probably too much for one, and not quite enough for two, but given some time it would probably have worked out satisfactorily. He continued barbering for another 7 years, and in 1968 he became a motor vehicle inspector for the Missouri State Highway Patrol. He operated the truck scales on 1 to 35, and moved to nearby Liberty, Missouri, where he worked for the next 20 years before retiring in 1988. After leaving his shop, I don't recall of ever seeing him again. He was a nice fellow and I had enjoyed his company. Yo had been trading work with a neighbor, Willard Pulliam. They got along real well together and became good friends. One day Willard told Yo that he heard that the city of St. Joe was taking bids for the farm ground that surrounded the runways at Rosecrans Field. It contained 900 acres of prime bottomland, and would raise much larger crops than they were accustomed to raising on their old hill ground. They placed the highest bid, and got the lease, and started farming in a big way. In October of 1961, Yo moved his family to Wathena, Kansas, where they rented a house. From there it was only a 10-minute drive to the airport. They only lived there 6 months, and during that time, they bought a 90-acre farm on Mosquito Skeeter Creek Road, 1 mile north of Troy, Kansas. The following April of 1962, they moved into their very own home. 62, they moved into their very own home. 62, they moved into their very own home. 62.